one of the blatant examples is what France continues to do to Francophone countries. Blatant day robbery of at least $500 billion every single year from Francophone countries on the continent. But nobody is willing to talk about these things, even Francophone leaders, because they're too scared and they do not want to misalign their personal interests for their own private gains. But do not get mistaken and think that Africans do not have a voice. There is one woman that is standing up and saying enough is enough. She is Dr. Arikana Chihombori, and we will be talking about her today and just dissecting some of her previous statements and public quotations and the position that she's taken when it comes to what the West continues to do in Africa in terms of post-colonial abuse. Hello there, my name is Ndero Ganga. I am a business journalist by profession and I'm also a digital content creator. I have a YouTube channel at Ondero Ganga where I talk about diaspora matters, so relocating to the continent, real time and real life experiences, how the journey has been, the ups and downs, so we can all learn lessons from each other and build a community of like-minded people. Now, let's get to today's video. A little bit of background. I did know Dr. Chihombori until recently, and a part of me always wondered, why aren't we seeing as many leaders in high diplomatic positions speaking out against some of these things? You know, sometimes some of these countries, I come from Kenya, and Kenya has had its own security challenges when it comes to the insurgence of Al-Shabaab in Somalia, which has bled into Kenya, and we've suffered from some terror incidents. And immediately it happens, what happens is travel advisory. There's just so much that happens, and I'm like, guys, relax. Terror attacks happen everywhere. I mean, we call it terror attacks here. In some places they're called mass shootings. Insecurity is on the rise. It's just so unfair how African countries are always treated on the global scale. It's not just insecurity, it's in terms of trade, it's in terms of financing, it's in terms of how they're perceived, how they're treated. Part of it, we have ourselves to blame because of how we present ourselves and the people that we put in office. But also part of it is because these people are not speaking up for us, but not anymore. Now, Dr. Chihombori has been very vocal on the most controversial and touchy issues. A little bit of background, just the other day, I currently live in Ghana. Ghana defaulted on its international debt. Now, if you don't know Ghana, Ghana is a country in West Africa, and from 2017, 18, 19, it was coming up really well. Before the pandemic, Ghana was almost the West African gateway, like the gateway into West Africa for the rest of the world. It was coming up really well. Its currency was the best currency performing against the dollar. That was 2018. People were coming here. They opened up the country through the year of return campaign in 2019, and things were beginning to look really, really good. The economy was growing. COVID-19 happened, Russia invasion of Ukraine happened, and also just poor leadership, and we ended up defaulting on our debt, and things haven't been really good. Debt to GDP ratio had crossed 80%. You know, we were using almost half of the resources that we collect and make internally to pay off interest rates on debt, so we were not necessarily at a good place. Part of it is our making, because you cannot borrow and use money for ventures that will not bring back money. You cannot borrow and use it on recurrent expenditure to pay salaries. That's warped logic. But then again, the terms in the contracts, they always say the devil is in the details. We don't treat these contracts as Africans, but also the people that draft these contracts are very, very conniving. Now, Dr. Chihombori is always raising a very valid question. Africans are in dire need of resources, and they do not have enough resources, right? But resources in terms of money, not natural resources. But these are the people that you're lending to. And I get the econometrics of money, that if someone is high risk, then the interest rates go up. But they have collateral as natural resources. But Africans will get loans at the most expensive rate. We'll get loans at 13%, 14%, 15%. Yet countries like the US will get loans at 1%, at 2%. And she even says, you take a country like China, right? China, 1.4 billion people, Eswatini, 1.4 million people, and you want to say that the playing ground is leveled? You want to treat them, in fact, you want to treat Eswatini with a iron fist and treat China with a velvet glove? Make it make sense. Anyway, I'm rambling too much. Listen to what she had to say.
IMF, World Bank, all other institutions, they make African countries jump through hoops. Loans will never be able to pay. The US, when they borrow money, they're getting it in 1.5, 1.9 interest rate. Africans, when they get the same amount of money, they're paying 9, 10%. The people who don't need a break, they get a break. The ones who need a break, they don't get a break. The sheer survival of the World Bank, IMF, is based on the fact that African countries and many other developing countries do not succeed. Their success is based on our failure.
The minimum average an African country is paying on loan repayment is around 35%. Mm-hmm. The majority around 50%. Mm-hmm. So half of your GDP goes towards paying loan repayment. Zimbabwe, we're still paying loans from Ian Smith.
Right. From everything that she said, my jaw is always just left on the floor. But what baffles me the most is beyond the contractual robbery of Africa and the contractual abuse that happens on paper, it's also happening in real life. I'll give you a practical example. DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo. There has been a civil war going on there for a really long time. Now, I say this without fear or favor. DRC is one of the most wealthy African countries in terms of natural resources. Gold is there. They have timber. They have lithium. Recently they discovered electric charged stones there. So you can imagine the potential that country has. And that country is always at war. Now, the anatomy of war, the dichotomy of war, somebody has to fund the war. If a country has been at war and there's a civil insurgence for 5 years, 10 years, where's the money to fund the war coming from?
The multinationals who are stealing from Africa every day in broad daylight. I use an example of the DRC. If you ever fly very low over the DRC, you'll see tarmacs in the jungle. You'll see 747s flying into DRC, picking up minerals and flying right out. The same multinationals are responsible for arming young people and giving them MK-16s. Because why? Their satellites in the skies are telling them where that village is. There are lots of diamonds. So what do? Arm young people, drag them up, and send them to go chop off a few heads. The rest of the village runs away, so they come behind and do their illegal mining. We black people must understand what is really going on. Because what we are shown instead is, oh, look at those Africans killing each other. There are some serious games that have been played in Africa for far too long. And once we understand that, we can strategize.
And if you think the case in DRC is worse, then you haven't heard about what's happening in Francophone countries. When I tell you that France has a chokehold on the countries that it colonized in Africa, it's an understatement. France literally has its boot on the neck of very many Francophone countries. Everything that these people do has to go through France, has to get the approval of France. Their resources are tied to France. Some of the infrastructure that France developed during the colonial era, some of these countries are still paying back for those resources, as if the French did not develop that infrastructure to enable them carry out the activities that they had come to carry out here. Slave trade, using cheap labor, stealing the minerals and natural resources of the continent, because that is what it was. Nobody paid the actual amount of the resources that they took from Africa. But until this day, France still dictates what Francophone countries should do, can do, who will lead these countries, how much money they make, how much money they take out, how much money. Everything that these countries do, France has a say in it. And let me tell you, when I tell you that Dr. Chiyombori is not afraid of anybody, she is not, because she says Macron needs to exit Africa.
These countries are very capable of negotiating their own deals. Their funds don't have to go through the French central bank. Even countries wanting to trade with African countries, they don't have to go through French central bank. So there are all those technicalities that are just stupid. What's needed is complete separation. France has got to get out of Africa, really, honestly. Enough is enough. To take $500 billion out of Africa, I mean, it is insanity of the highest order. In countries that are supposedly poor, in making those countries fund French education, French healthcare system, create jobs for French youth while we are struggling in our country. It's no longer sustainable. President Macron needs to wake up and smell the coffee. And the African youth are the ones he's going to have to deal with. The African youth are not taking it anymore. They want what belongs to them. Financial institutions, them too. If I had my way, all the African heads of states should stop paying back any loans that were given by IMF and World Bank. Those loans have been paid gazillion times over.
While many of these things happen on the continent and we might look like we are helpless, we are not. I think sometimes it boils down to the leaders that we choose. If you look at bodies like the European Union, they are very strong. I think when the pandemic came, they were very organized. They got their money together. They bought vaccines and sort of like hoarded vaccines. The rest of the world did not have vaccines, but then they had in excess. And it's because some of these organizations or unions, they've planned themselves well. They have very aggressive and brute leaders who think about their people. When you look at the African Union, in all honesty, it's the biggest joke of a union that we have on the continent, because how is it that all these years down the line, Africa still doesn't trade with itself? Trade in Europe is over 50%. Trade in Asia is about 70%. Trade in Africa is under 20%. It's actually 16% the last time I checked. You need visas to visit most of these African countries. The restrictions that are there, the tariff barriers to do business, to move people, to move goods is nearly impossible. An African cannot just walk into another African country. Very few African countries have that agreement with each other. There's still very many hurdles that were set by white people, and we continue to uphold them, Stockholm Syndrome. And Dr. Arikana Chihombori says, listen, it's time we put visionary, tough, and strong leaders in office to lead Africa and the African Union to where it needs to be.
We don't get an African Union chair who realizes that you're under the table and they're making you fight with your brothers and sisters as to who got the larger chunk of the crumbs under the table. That way, you never have to talk about what's on the table. That is a blind chair. We need somebody who gets it. I do know that there's a need for major disruption at the African Union level.
You know, she also goes ahead and calls up on the diaspora. I mean, recently I saw a meme that says the goal is to leave Africa, go to Europe or America, and then pray for Africa. I get it. Times can be tough, but okay. In all honesty, these days I understand when people say they want to leave the continent because opportunities are very scarce. That's a given. But you coming back to the continent when you're 60 to retire doesn't do any justice for the system, right? You've given all your years to whichever place you moved to, you've helped build that place. What have you done for your home? You know, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country, which is easier said than done. But like when you're part of the diaspora community, what are you guys doing besides remittances, you know? What are you guys doing? You guys are the people that have seen how systems should work, how effective systems should be. How can you contribute towards the development at home? And Dr. Arikana is like, we cannot be having more doctors in America in one city or in one state than the whole of Nigeria. It literally does not make sense.
There are more Ghanaian doctors in New York City than in the entire country of Ghana. There are more Nigerian doctors in LA than in the entire country of Nigeria. So let's be serious here. What Africa needs is capacity, capacity, capacity. And that capacity is in the diaspora. So it behooves us to bring the diaspora together. Let them understand what is really going on in our Africa. Diaspora are not going home. Diaspora are angry about Africa because they are not understanding the root cause of why Africa is where it is today. They think getting rid of a president will take care of the problem. Far from it. That president is just going to be replaced by another one who's going to equally suffer from the same difficult environment to work in. So let's look at an Africa that must be free to take care of herself, an Africa that's free from exploitation from outsiders.
Listen, I think that I can go on and on and on about my love for Dr. Chihombori, how much I love her, how much I adore her, and I could sit literally the whole day and just listen to her speak because she's very thought-provoking and very revolutionary in the way she thinks and the way she articulates this issue without fear or favor, and that's the thing that I love the most about her. We've come to the close of this episode of this chat. It was so lovely doing this with you guys. If you enjoyed this kind of conversation and you'd like me to also like review more prolific African thought leaders, Winnie Byanyima, Dambisa